What made you walk out of an interview? I was being interviewed for a business analyst position and the interview was already strange. They had me waiting for 40 minutes and then the interview was done by 2 people. One asked, if I could be any animal, what would it be? Now, I believed this to be an extremely odd question for such a role, and I responded that I wasn't sure how my connection with an animal would apply to this job. Further into the interview, I was asked what the difference between a data scientist and a data analyst was, and I said the most textbook answer I could and said, I'd consider a data analyst like a nurse and a data scientist like a doctor. The analyst will have lots of experience with front-end analysis and observation, while the scientist will be more adept at in-depth whys, predictions, etc. Which is why one is paid x23 the other. The woman who asked stated how extremely offended she was at my statement and rambled for about 5 minutes. At this point, I stood up, said thank you for your time, but I am going to pursue other options and left. What is your story? So we expect our employees to go above and beyond. And went on to say that basically everyone will work 60 hours a week, for 40 hours of pay. See ya. I went to an interview and was ushered into an office that clearly did not belong to the interviewer in the ill-fitting suit. After a few minutes it became clear that this marketing job was clearly a sales role. As a marketing grad who specializes in analytics, I wish people would stop listing sales jobs as marketing positions. Edit. My first gold. Thank you kindly. Nice one smiley face. When I was in high school, the White Castle down the street was hiring. I lived in a bad area, and it was open 24/7. I went in and applied, but let them know that I was in school and couldn't do overnights because of that and because of the area. They assured me that this was fine and that they could get me in after school and out before midnight. I go in for interview orientation on a Tuesday afternoon around 6, and they've got the schedule set I'm on after orientation 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. or some shit. So, I pull the shift lead aside like, hey, I was told that because of my school situation, I wouldn't be on overnights. I'm on the schedule for overnight tonight. I have school tomorrow, and I wasn't even aware I'd have a shift today. I was told it was just orientation. How do we fix this? She goes, well, everybody gotta work overnight, it is what it is. I went, gotcha. Thanks for your time. Took off the apron, handed it to her, and left her and the rest of the orientation group, who were stunned. Slite. Slite. I was a crew chief in a warehouse at my previous job. The interviewer read this on my resume and thought it said crew chef and asked me if this was a joke. I politely corrected him and explained my previous position. He didn't believe me but continued with the interview anyways. As the interview went on I quickly realized that the interviewer was in fact one of the supervisors in this facility and that not only did he fundamentally not understand the freight industry but he could barely read or spell. I knew there was no way I could work under this guy so I stood up, thanked him for his time and left. He told me I was an idiot and was throwing away an incredible opportunity. I didn't even turn around to acknowledge him. It felt like a bad comedy sketch. I had an interview last year. Teaching gig. The principal in charge of the interview was an hour late. That alone irritated me, but he showed up and we started the interview. 5 minutes in and he says, hey, let's walk around the campus, I'll show you around. That wasn't a big deal, we just walked and talked. The problem is that every time he saw someone, he'd stop and spend at least 5 minutes talking to them, regardless of whether or not I was done answering questions. I was there 2.5 hours for that interview. I said no. I went into an interview with a company when I was in college because they got my name off Indeed. There was a room they filled with 30 of us listening to what could only have been an MLM scheme. After 45 minutes of talking about how awesome the company is, how much fun they have, and how much money they make and without any talk of what the actual job was I stood up and was the first person to leave. About half of the room left with me. I was interviewing for a software development job that I didn't apply for, but contacted me. The job description was utterly ridiculous, it had a literal 30-something languages and technologies that it required. The job also paid below entry level for my field but wanted above what a senior dev does. I didn't want the job but I figured I'd interview for practice. I only matched 5 out of the 30-ish languages, technologies they wanted but since they called me I figured they saw something in my resume they wanted. Well, I found out shortly into the interview that they actually did want everything on the list. The lady interviewing me was offended that I showed up to the interview without matching their silly qualifications. I politely reminded them they contacted me and thanked them for their time and left. The job was still open for another 2 years after that day. I hadn't checked after that, so who knows, maybe it's still open. Slite. Sounds like they didn't want applicants from the US and just needed to make it seem like they tried to find local employees, but just had to pay a guy from India half as much for the job. Companies exploit the visa system this way. The position had been advertised as a $7 per hour waitressing job, which would be absolutely stunning due to 99% of serving jobs being $2 an hour. Drove 45 minutes. Halfway through the interview, I asked about the pay, since it was unusual for a restaurant to not try to pay the absolute minimum. Was expecting to hear that maybe they didn't do tipping, or maybe that they just felt strongly about making changes to serving culture or something. Oh, no, it's the $2 per hour, obviously. But. Oh, the ad said $7. He rolled his eyes, then goes, well, yeah, you're gonna make $7 after tips. He knew full well what it looked like in the ad to say it was $7 per hour. I was disgusted, got up and left. $2 per hour I can deal with. Tricking people into applying by making it look way better than it is? No bueno. Edit because everyone outside of the USA is freaking out about the $2 thing. In the USA, waitstaff is paid at an hourly rate of $2. The expectation in that they will reach the federal minimum wage level with tips, and if they do not, the restaurant is supposed to pay the difference. Spoiler. Often, it's more likely that they'll just cut your hours to nothing until you quit. Edit. To be fair, I should point out that for most servers, they make far above minimum wage, and more than cooks, after tips. On an exceptionally good night, I have made $300. Most of the time I'd guess it averages $20 per hour. Edit. This was asked a lot. I'm from Michigan. This experience was in circa 2004. Source. A tipped employee engages in an occupation in which he or she customarily and regularly receives more than $30 per month in tips. An employer of a tipped employee is only required to pay $2.13 per hour in direct wages if that amount combined with the tips received at least equals the federal minimum wage. If the employee's tips combined with the employer's direct wages of at least $2.13 per hour do not equal the federal minimum hourly wage, the employer must make up the difference. Many states, however, require higher direct wage amounts for tipped employees. Also, if you think that's terrible, I once briefly worked as an Outback Steakhouse takeout server. You still only make $2 per hour, but nobody tips you. Ever. Because they think you're not a real server. Edit. I'm not saying we were the same as a server. But we did made all salads, prepped soups and sides, etc. We were in the kitchen more than the servers and we did a lot of running to keep up with all the orders. Again, not comparing this to servers. Just saying that we didn't just stand there and hand you a bag. Just for context, edit. I want to make it very clear that I'm not defending this model or anything. I am just saying this is what it was, is from my experience. Personally, I just feel like the system is always going to find some way to screw over waitstaff no matter what happens with wage adjustments. But I'm sure that a fatalistic view. I'm glad it's better elsewhere. Back when I was doing hourly work, I got a long voicemail from a retail store asking me to call them back to set up an interview. I called them back as soon as I could and explained to whoever was on the phone that I got a call about XYZ and they transferred me to the manager. The manager gets on the phone and says, "Hi, thanks for calling me back. Just so you know, sweetie, it's incredibly rude to not ask for a person by name over the phone." I can't even recall if this person stated their name in the incredibly long voicemail I got. I stopped her there and said, "Sorry, I'm no longer interested in this position, bye." Oof. That sweetie churns my noodles. The pay they needed a ton of references and multiple interviews. In the end she goes, "So the starting wage is the minimum wage." I said, "Well, your ad said $20 per hour." She said, "That's after 15 years." I promptly walked out. 15 years? How did they say that with a straight face? That's after 15 years, fuck outta here lol. What kinda job was it? I applied for a middle school science teacher position in a pretty bad inner city school district. Sat down in the principal's office and she had my resume, application, all my supplemental paperwork in a folder. When I walked in she closed the folder, moved it to the side and said, "I'm sure you're very qualified. I haven't even read through this. I'm going to offer you this position on the spot because you're male and over 6 feet tall. I don't need a teacher, I need someone to control the kids in the classroom. Will you take the job?" Thanked her for her time and couldn't get out of there fast enough. Well, at least she was honest, I guess? Geez, that's bad. Was invited to an interview through Monster for a job I hadn't applied for. I was desperate at the time and I said fuck it, I'll go and give it a shot. Walked into a small commercial building and there were 7 or 8 folding chairs in a small entrance area with a hallway and a couple small offices attached. There were 5 older folks, mid-40s. I was around 23 at the time, and they all had clipboards. A woman walked through the hall and says hello, hands me a clipboard and to fill out the info. It was super weird. Asking for more personal and financial questions than I was willing to offer. Stuck around anyways for the interview. Office was set up super suspiciously, like they'd thrown a painting on the wall, plant in the corner and that's it. Finally sit down with the dude interviewing me. He kept talking about this big opportunity and to get in now while the getting is good, blah blah. Never actually dictated what the job actually was. Realized it was a goddamn pyramid scheme almost immediately. I stopped dude mid-sentence and told him I appreciated the time but I'm going to have to pass. He was baffled. I then walked outside to the 5 or 6 people sitting there and told them all, while dude's door still ajar, that it was a pyramid scheme and to take the sheets of paper they were filling out and rip them up or take them with them. They all looked, much like myself, desperate. I felt horrible for them. Didn't stick around to see if any of them left or not. Total sketch. Edit. Thanks to you, Graham's Contest account too, for providing and reminding me of the company name American Income Life. Pretty early into the interview she pointed out I had a gap in employment, which was the 6 weeks between when I graduated in May and when I started in July. She asked me to explain it and I told her I signed with them in April before I graduated to start in July and took those weeks to get all my moving done and getting settled into a new town. She told me I would have to resubmit my application with an explanation for why I have that gap in employment. At this point it was 6 years prior, and they shouldn't have passed me on for an interview without it. She also had zero sense of humor, took everything very seriously, and was dogmatic about how the company operates. This was to be my supervisor. She read some behavioral question about a situation, can't remember specifically, and I asked her to elaborate on the circumstances, and she just repeated the question verbatim without looking up from the sheet. It was at that point I sat back, sighed, and said, "I don't think this is going to be a good fit, but thank you for your time." She dumped my papers into the trash bin next to her desk and said, "Well, thanks for wasting my afternoon." I shook my head and walked out. Was contacted for an IT position in a nearby town, put on the suit, etc., and got there about 20 minutes early. There were 4 other people in the reception area. No worries, I was confident in my skills. Soon enough I met with my interviewer. We went over my credentials and background, and I was asked career-relevant questions. Then about 15 minutes into the interviewer said something which I found a little odd, so I asked for clarification. It was then that I was told it was for a sales job, specifically a cold-calling sales job. They started extolling the virtues of a career change. I said something along the lines of this not being the position I was led to believe and left the room. As I was leaving, one of the interviewers made a remark about me making a big mistake. I stopped in the lobby on the way out and made the general announcement that whatever job they were here to interview for, it's actually a cold call sales job. About 2/3 of the people in the room got up and left with me, and I got a bunch of glares from the workers there. When I got back outside I parked my car near the entrance and told anyone who looked like they were going in for an interview that it was a cold sales job. I was there for about 45 minutes before a police car rolled up and had me move along. One of the people in the office heard what I was doing and called them. I realized I was way out of my depth. The job was in my field, at a salary that would be sensible for my level of experience and qualification, and the job ad was pretty boilerplate for what I do. Through the interview it became clear that what they were actually looking for was someone to do some very advanced modeling as well as effectively replace the CFO who was retiring. I told them quite bluntly that I could probably learn the modeling, but I wouldn't be able to hit the ground running. and elements of the CFO role would have to be outsourced, by law, if they hired me, as I wasn't qualified enough to carry them out. And while I'd possibly consider the job on those conditions, the salary they're offering for the expertise and experience they needed was at least 50% too low. They looked a bit shocked, so I just said also, I'm not very good at playing the corporate game. I say what I think, which is a very useful thing for advising the C-level, because I don't have an agenda and I don't play politics. I just wanted to put my cards on the table so we don't waste each other's time. At that point, one of them got really angry, red in the face, raised voice, so I stood up, thanked them for their time and started walking out. He actually tried to stop me getting out the door because you don't walk away from me, but I just laughed and his colleague pulled him away. One of the more interesting interviews I've had. Slite. Some, not all, but some people in corporate positions of power are truly egomaniac pieces of shit. It's fascinating since what they do rarely has any meaningful impact in real life. I work in corporate, it's awful. I really wanted this job. I prepped for a week and a half for the interview. Go in, met with 2 people, it's going great. 45 minutes later they tell me that position had already been filled. But they liked me enough for a position that was part-time and half the salary, which also meant no benefits. It was like going to a shoe store saying you need a 7.5 in black and the guy comes back and says, yeah, we don't have a 7.5, but here's a 12 in green you can try. If the job is no longer available, delete it from your site. Don't play people and waste their time. Lol, guess I'm still a little sore about this. They demanded that I give them my social security number before I could be interviewed. I told them I would happily provide them with my SS hash when I was hired. They wouldn't let me into the interview without it, I just left. Turned out to be a door-to-door sales position. Just interrupted their pitch, told them I wasn't interested and left. They called the police on the guy who was waiting to interview after me. He was just a Native American dude sitting in this hotel lobby. The job was at a hotel. The guy interviewing me saw him, brought me into his office and then called the cops and said there was a homeless guy who wouldn't leave the lobby. I tried to explain that I had talked to him and that he was also applying for the job, but the guy didn't care. I just said, wow man, I don't want to work for a place like this, and left. He seemed genuinely stunned and angry that I walked out. Had an interview for a warehouse supervisor. Arrived a little early and front desk had me go over to the shipping department office and wait for the operations manager. Sat down by his office and overheard him having his meeting with other supervisors and leads. Heard screaming and throwing of stuff. Constant degrading vocabulary. Notepad out of there quickly. It was the second interview, a working interview with the CEO for a VP level position. She was micromanaging me. When I pointed that out, she said, yes, I will be micromanaging you. This is not going to work out, I replied. I closed my laptop, got my blazer, thanked her for the opportunity and wished her the best of luck. She was surprised at the combination of me walking away from the interview, my cordiality, my non-judgmental attitude. There's no right, wrong. Only what works for us individually and what doesn't. Micromanaging works for you, but doesn't work for me. About 6 months later she called me asking if I wanted to do some contract work. I told her that I was too busy to take on a consulting gig. A competitor was trying to hire me away from my bank. The head of research asked me what it would take to hire me away. I said a lot more money. He said I like to hire people who aren't motivated by money. I laughed and replied that I wasn't aware his bank was a charity, got up, and left. Slite. I interviewed once to be a hypnotist's assistant. The hypnotist explained to me the job entailed sitting in the audience, volunteering to be hypnotized as part of the act, pretending to go into a hypnotic trance and removing my clothes. I didn't proceed with the rest of the interview. I was told I would be interviewed by 3 people at once, which is not that unusual. What they didn't tell me was that they were going to have 6 other candidates in the room vying for one position. I didn't walk out, but I did pull an interviewer aside and say I was no longer interested in the position. When I found out that the company was an MLM. I arrived for the interview and was told the person who arranged the interview the day before was no longer with the company. Okay. The person led me down to the workplace in the bowels of the building. We sat down and she started explaining the hours and pay, minimum wage with no increase for at least a year. Okay, She pointed to two guys who were standing by a wall staring at us and said that whenever I wasn't busy I would help them. Meanwhile there was a line of customers waiting for service while they stared at me and whispered to each other. Okay. She never once looked at my resume or references. Okay. Then she pulled out the paperwork to start me working and said my first shift would be the next day. Okay. I said I don't think this is going to work for me and thanked her. She just sighed and said fine. I kept track and that job is regularly posted on job sites. We only need this for census information and it won't affect if you get hired, followed by a laundry list of questions about sexual orientation, family history, gender, political affiliations. Like if it's just for census you would ask after you've hired someone. Nothing crazy. But I had an interview for an accounting position and when the interviewer started describing the job duties to me they included running errands and planning the cookouts for the staff. When I asked what accounting duties there were he said oh, like mailing out invoices. I thanked him for his time and walked on out. People interviewing for accounting positions most likely aren't going to be willing to drop down to errand boy title. I also can't imagine how little money they would have offered for that position.